Picture this. It's the late 19th century. You are looking at a young woman who, by the rigid standards of her era, is basically expected to sit quietly in a parlor.
Right, maybe do some needlepoint.
Exactly. Needlepoint, pouring tea, and definitely not making a fuss. But instead, she goes entirely off script. I mean, she goes undercover into a notorious, freezing, insane asylum just to expose its horrors.
Oh, and she races around the entire globe just to beat a fictional record set by a book character.
Yes. She confronts a dictator in Mexico, she patents industrial machinery, and then, just for an encore, she reports from the muddy, freezing trenches of World War I.
Which is wild. You would think we were talking about, like, 5 different historical figures, or maybe a comic book superhero.
Seriously, but this is the actual documented life of one single person.
It sounds exactly like a Hollywood script that a studio executive would reject for being completely unbelievable, but it is entirely real. We're talking about Nellie Bly.
And what we are looking at today in this deep dive, using her comprehensive biography, is how a young woman with zero formal training practically invented modern immersion journalism.
Yeah, she really did.
We want to understand how she shattered the glass ceilings of her era and managed to live about 5 different lifetimes in her 57 years. And this deep dive is for you, the ultimate learner, who wants those aha moments of history without, wading through dry textbook summaries.
Which is why she isn't just a historical curiosity. Nellie Bly is the literal blueprint for how we consume investigative media right now.
Oh, for sure.
Every time you watch an undercover documentary or read an immersive first-person piece of journalism, you're experiencing the legacy of what she started. I mean, she completely rewired the relationship between the reader, the reporter, and the truth.
To really get into that headspace, I see your virtual study backdrop has shifted to set the mood perfectly. We are looking at a sepia-tone 19th century newsroom.
It's a great vibe, right?
It really is. I can practically hear the clacking of the mechanical printing presses and smell the heavy ink. It is the perfect setting to figure out how an ordinary girl from Pennsylvania becomes this global icon. Because she definitely did not start with a silver spoon.
Far from it, actually.
Yeah.
She was born Elizabeth Jane Cochran in 1864 in Armstrong County, Pennsylvania.
And didn't she have a kind of funny childhood nickname?
Yeah, so as a child, she wore the color pink so often that her family literally just called her Pink.
That's amazing.
Right. But as she grew into a teenager, she wanted to project a much more sophisticated image. So she dropped the childhood nickname and even added an E to her last name, becoming Cochran.
I can completely understand a little teenage rebranding, but her early years were legitimately tough. Her father died when she was just 6.
Yeah, which changed everything for them financially.
Right. And later, she enrolled at a normal school, which was the term for teacher training colleges back then, but she was forced to drop out after just one single term. The funds simply weren't there.
So she and her mother eventually had to move to the Pittsburgh area to find work.
And this is where the spark really catches fire. In 1885, she is reading the Pittsburgh Dispatch, and she comes across this incredibly sexist column. The headline is literally, "What Girls Are Good For."
And you have to understand the historical context here. The argument of the column wasn't just a fringe opinion.
Right, it was kind of the norm.
Exactly. It represented the structural reality of 1885. The writer argued that women were principally meant for birthing children and keeping the house, and that a working woman was basically a monstrosity.
So Elizabeth reads this, and she is absolutely furious. She writes a blazing, fiery rebuttal to the newspaper, and she signs it with the pseudonym Lonely Orphan Girl.
Which is such a dramatic pen name.
So dramatic. Okay, let's unpack this, because here is what I love about 19th century media. The editor of the paper, George Madden, reads this response and is so blown away by her passion and her sharp writing that he actually runs an advertisement in his own paper.
Right, just to find her.
Yes. He's literally begging this lonely orphan girl to please come forward and identify herself. It is essentially the 1880s equivalent of leaving such a brilliant, scathing reply on a viral blog post that the publication tracks your IP address just to offer you a job as a lead columnist.
That is a great way to look at it. I mean, in an era before social media, letters to the editor were the primary way a publication gauged community engagement.
True.
Madden recognized raw, unfiltered talent. So when she introduced herself, he immediately offered her the chance to write a piece for the paper, still using that pseudonym.
And she didn't pull any punches with that first piece either.
Not at all. Her first article was called The Girl Puzzle, and she argued that not all women were destined to marry. And what society actually needed was to provide better, safer jobs for women.
Wow, right out of the gate.
Yeah. Her second piece was called Mad Marriages, which tackled how divorce laws disproportionately hurt women, arguing for immediate reform.
But for that second article, she needed a new name. Why couldn't she just write under Elizabeth Cochran? Why the constant pseudonyms?
What's fascinating here is that it came down to the deeply ingrained sexism of the readership. It was standard practice for female journalists to conceal their true identities.
Just to get published.
Partially that, but primarily so that the male readership wouldn't immediately dismiss or discredit their work before even reading it. They needed a persona. So Elizabeth chose a pen name based on a popular Stephen Foster song called Nellie Bly.
But there's a typo, right?
Yeah. When the piece went to print, her editor accidentally misspelled it with an I-E at the end, N-E-L-L-I-E, and that mistake just stuck forever.
Along with the name, the job stuck too. Madden offered her a full-time position, but she didn't just sit at a desk writing opinion pieces. She immediately went out into the field.
She was a woman of action.
Completely. She went undercover as a poor woman to get hired at a copper cable factory. She wanted to report firsthand on the horrible working conditions that working-class women and children were facing.
Setting a huge precedent for her whole career.
Exactly. And the workers loved her for it. They finally felt seen. But the factory owners, as you might expect, were furious. They threatened the paper, and the paper actually caved.
It's just so disappointing.
It is. They demoted her to the women's pages to cover fashion, society gossip, and gardening.
Which, for a mind like hers, was just a gilded cage. She was 21 years old, and she famously declared that she was determined to do something no girl has done before.
I love that quote.
Yeah, she fundamentally refused to be sidelined.
Which brings us to a massive thematic shift in her life. Instead of just quitting and finding another paper in Pittsburgh, she actively seeks out a much more dangerous stage. And I see your virtual background has just shifted from the newsroom to these incredibly imposing cold stone corridors.
Setting the scene for the next chapter.
Yes, this looks like a 19th century asylum, which tells me exactly where we are heading. But before she tackled the institutions of New York, we have to talk about how she spent her 21st year.
Right. She essentially self-funds a trip to Mexico to serve as a foreign correspondent for 6 months.
Just picks up and goes.
Yep. And she wasn't just writing polite travelogues about the architecture. She actively protested the imprisonment of a local journalist who had criticized the Mexican government. Now, at this time, Mexico was under the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. You did not publicly criticize the regime.
That is incredibly dangerous for anyone, let alone a 21-year-old foreign woman in the 1880s.
Exactly. When the authorities caught wind of her reporting, they explicitly threatened her with arrest. She basically had to flee the country to avoid being thrown in a Mexican prison.
That is terrifying.
It was. But once she was safely back in the United States, she compiled her dispatches into a book called 6 Months in Mexico, where she openly accused Diaz of being a tyrannical czar who controlled the press.
So, having survived the wrath of a dictator, she moves to New York City in 1887. And despite her incredible portfolio, she faces a wall of rejection. Editors simply would not hire a woman for hard news.
It was a total boys' club.
Totally. After 4 months, she is practically penniless. But she eventually manages to talk her way into the offices of Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper, The New York World. And she takes an assignment that is, frankly, terrifying.
The Blackwell's Island assignment.
Yes. She agrees to feign insanity to investigate reports of extreme brutality at the women's lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island, which is now Roosevelt Island.
The mechanism of just getting inside is fascinating because the commitment process required immense psychological fortitude. She didn't just knock on the asylum door and ask for a tour.
No, she had to really sell it.
She checked herself into a boarding house for working-class females under an assumed name. She stayed up all night to give herself a genuinely disturbed, physically exhausted look.
I can't even imagine how grueling that must have been.
Oh, and then she started making wild, paranoid accusations, telling the assistant matron that the other boarders were insane. She acted so erratically that the boarding house called the police. She was examined by a police officer, then a judge, and finally a doctor. And she successfully convinced all of them that she had lost her mind. After a brief stay at Bellevue Hospital, she was put on a boat to Blackwell's Island.
I want you, listening right now, to just imagine the psychological weight of this. Imagine checking yourself into an incredibly dark, isolated facility, surrounded by doctors who have absolute, unquestionable authority over your reality.
It's the ultimate trap.
It is, because once she was officially admitted and the heavy door is locked behind her, she dropped the act entirely. She stopped pretending to be mad. She acted completely sane, polite, and lucid.
But the terrifying realization was that her sanity didn't matter. The doctors had already succumbed to confirmation bias.
Because she was labeled insane upon entry.
Right, so every rational thing she did was interpreted as a symptom of her madness. She was subjected to the exact same treatments as the other patients. We were talking about freezing baths, rancid food, and physical abuse from the nurses.
And she documented all of it. What I find incredibly poignant is who she focused on. She didn't just talk about her own suffering.
No, she was very observant of the others.
She paid special attention to how poor and immigrant women who simply couldn't speak English and weren't actually mentally ill, were locked away just because society didn't know what else to do with them.
She repeatedly asked to be discharged, explicitly pointing out her own sanity, and was repeatedly denied. It took 10 grueling days before an attorney sent by the world finally intervened and secured her release.
Thank goodness they finally sent someone.
Seriously. Her subsequent investigative report, published in October 1887 and later expanded into a book called 10 Days in a Madhouse, caused an absolute sensation.
Okay, I have to push back a little here, though. Let's look at the journalism landscape of the late 1800s, especially with figures like Joseph Pulitzer.
Okay, let's hear it.
Wasn't this whole thing, the so-called stunt journalism, really just a highly cynical circulation-boosting gimmick? I mean, Pulitzer knew a story about a young woman trapped in a madhouse would sell thousands of papers. Wasn't he just exploiting her and putting her in immense danger for profit?
That is a very fair critique. And to understand it, we have to look at the economics of the new journalism movement. In the late 1880s, newspapers dropped their prices to a single penny.
Which means you need volume.
Massive volume. To survive on penny papers, you needed massive, unprecedented daily circulation. Sensationalism wasn't just a stylistic choice. It was a ruthless business survival tactic.
Yeah.
Pulitzer absolutely wanted to sell papers, and he knew danger sold.
So it was exploitation.
Well, yes and no. If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to balance Pulitzer's profit motive against the structural barriers Nellie Bly faced. This specific genre of immersion journalism provided women with their very first, and frankly only, wedge into hard news.
Oh, I see. It was the only way in.
Exactly. It was the only way a male editor would put a woman on the front page. But Bly elevated it from a mere stunt into legitimate social reform. Her reporting wasn't just lurid details, it forced a grand jury investigation.
Which is real-world impact.
Huge impact.
Huh?
It resulted in a massive budget increase for the Department of Public Charities and Corrections. She used Pulitzer's sensationalist machine to force actual systemic policy changes. She proved that empathy could be weaponized for public good.
That makes a lot of sense. So after exposing the trauma of the asylum, she realizes that uncovering systemic abuse takes a massive psychological toll. And she decides to pivot from the dark, hidden underbelly of society to a bright, inspiring spectacle of human endurance.
A completely different tone.
Right, and I see your background has changed again to a vintage world map trapping a nautical route, complete with brass maritime instruments.
Because in 1888, she approached her editor with a pitch that was incredibly audacious. She wanted to turn Jules Verne's famous fictional book, Around the World in 80 Days, into reality.
And not just read it, but do it.
Do it, and do it faster than the fictional character, Phileas Fogg.
The paper agrees, but in typical chaotic fashion, they give her a massive 2 days' notice to pack.
2 days. Can you imagine?
I panic packing for a weekend trip. But in November 1889, she boards the steamer Augusta Victoria and sets off on a journey of nearly 25,000 miles. And here's where it gets really interesting. How does a woman travel alone globally in 1889?
It's mind-boggling.
How does that physically work without GPS, without instant translation apps, or the ability to wire money digitally?
It required an astonishing level of logistical brilliance. She relied heavily on the existing British imperial infrastructure. She was essentially hopping between colonial outposts, utilizing steamship timetables that were just beginning to become standardized globally.
What about money? She couldn't just use a credit card.
For money, she carried 200 pounds in British gold stored in a bag tied around her neck.
Around her neck.
Yeah, because British gold was the only universally accepted currency across all those borders. She traversed the Suez Canal, visited Ceylon, the Strait settlements in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Japan. She even managed a detour in France to meet Jules Verne himself.
And back home, Pulitzer's engagement machine was working in overdrive. The newspaper ran a Nellie Bly guessing match, where readers tried to estimate her exact arrival time down to the second.
With a grand prize of an all-expenses-paid trip to Europe, right?
Yep, it was a masterclass in building an audience.
It worked brilliantly. And she didn't just beat the 80 days. She completed the journey in just over 72 days, setting a new world record.
She did have a bit of uninvited competition, though.
True. A journalist named Elizabeth Baseland was actually racing her in the opposite direction for a rival magazine, The Cosmopolitan. But Bly's route and relentless pace won out.
So, coming off the biggest media triumph of the century, setting a world record, what does she do? She essentially quits reporting.
Which no one saw coming.
Right. She pivots entirely to writing serial novels for a publisher named Norman Munro. Between 1889 and 1895, she wrote 11 novels with titles like Eva the Adventuress.
Which is a very different kind of writing.
And for the longest time, historians thought these novels were entirely lost to time because the cheap paper they were printed on just disintegrated. It wasn't until 2021 that an author named David Blixt actually rediscovered these 11 lost novels in a British weekly archive.
It highlights her core skill, which is synthesizing her environment. Whether she was navigating international shipping routes or churning out serialized fiction, she was a master at understanding what an audience wanted and delivering it.
But the most shocking pivot of her life wasn't fiction. It was her sudden departure from the literary world altogether into the heavy, sparks-flying machinery of American industry.
Which perfectly explains the new backdrop.
Yes, we are suddenly inside a noisy 19th century steel manufacturing plant.
Welcome to the industrial era of Nellie Bly. In 1895, at the age of 31, she marries Robert Seaman, a millionaire manufacturer who is 73 years old.
Quite an age gap.
Yeah. Due to his failing health, she steps away from writing and eventually takes over as the president of his company, the Ironclad Manufacturing Co.
And she wasn't just a figurehead sitting in an office either. She was a registered inventor. She held U.S. patents under her married name, Elizabeth Cochran Seaman.
She patented a novel design for a milk can, right?
Yes, a milk can and a stacking garbage can. For a time, she was one of the leading female industrialists in the entire United States.
The company made massive steel containers, including boilers and vats. In fact, in 1904, the year her husband died, Ironclad began manufacturing the steel barrel that became the structural model for the 55-gallon oil drum we still use globally today.
That's incredible.
Right. While the patent was officially registered to an inventor named Henry Warehon, there are strong claims she was the visionary behind the design.
But here's the part of her story that deeply confuses me. This is a woman who was a razor-sharp social observer.
The best in the business.
She could walk into an asylum or a copper cable factory and immediately spot the systemic abuse, the lies, and the hidden truths from a mile away. Yet, as the head of Ironclad, she was completely blind to massive financial deceit happening right under her nose.
It is a bit baffling.
Unscrupulous managers embezzle hundreds of thousands of dollars from her, which ultimately led to protracted litigation and bankruptcy. How does a world-class investigative journalist get scammed in her own building?
This raises an important question about the nature of her genius. It really comes down to the difference between structural empathy and financial auditing.
Oh, that makes sense.
She ran her company very differently than the factory owners she'd investigated in her youth. She tried to build an industrial utopia, she provided health benefits, built libraries, and created recreational facilities for her workers.
Which is amazing for the time.
It was revolutionary. But her focus was entirely on social welfare and product invention. She completely ignored the ledger books. She trusted middle managers to handle the math while she handled the morale.
And unfortunately, weaponized empathy doesn't work on a spreadsheet.
Exactly. Those managers realized she wasn't looking at the finances, and they bled the company dry.
It is a tragic irony. When business ultimately failed and she lost everything, she naturally fell back on her true calling. She returned to journalism.
And she didn't miss a beat. In 1913, she covers the massive woman suffrage procession for the New York Evening Journal. Her headline was proudly, "Suffragists are men's superiors."
Very Nellie Bly headline.
Totally. And in her analysis, she accurately predicted that American women would win the right to vote in 1920.
And then, as if her life wasn't cinematic enough, World War I breaks out. She goes to Europe and becomes a frontline war correspondent on the Eastern Front.
Because of course she does.
She was one of the first foreigners to visit the muddy, dangerous war zone between Serbia and Austria. She even got arrested when she was mistaken for a British spy.
Add it to the list of wild experiences.
Right. She kept reporting, kept bearing witness to history, right up until she died of pneumonia in New York City in 1922 at the age of 57.
Her legacy is almost impossible to quantify because she disrupted so many different spheres of society. She was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame. She was honored on a U.S. postage stamp.
And there are physical monuments too, right?
Yeah, if you go to Roosevelt Island today, right where the asylum used to be, there is a stunning monument dedicated to her called the Girl Puzzle. The New York Press Club hands out a prestigious journalism award named after her.
There is even a large species of tarantula from Ecuador Pamphobatis, Nellie Bly, named in her honor by scientists.
Now that is unique.
The ultimate sign of respect, right? A giant spider. But seriously, so what does this all mean? What does this massive, chaotic, brilliant life mean for you listening right now?
It's a great question.
I think Nellie Bly's story proves that true expertise isn't about staying quietly in your lane. It is about boundless curiosity. It is about having the courage to look at the systems around you and say, just like she did at 21, that you want to do something no person has done before.
It's very inspiring.
In our modern world, where we are constantly paralyzed by information overload, endlessly scrolling through screens, her specific brand of immersion is a vital reminder. Sometimes, to really understand the truth of a situation, you have to log off, step out your front door, and experience the mechanics of the world firsthand.
That is a deeply practical takeaway. But I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over regarding the psychology of her journey.
Okay, let's hear it.
We have seen how Nellie Bly constantly adopted different personas. She was the fiery, lonely orphan girl. She was the terrified, gaslit mad woman in the asylum.
The globe-trotting adventurer.
Exactly. She was the wealthy, patent-holding industrialist. And she was the trench coat-wearing war correspondent. When you look at this incredible mosaic of a life, one has to wonder, was her relentless pursuit of all these different lives driven purely by a noble desire to expose the hidden truths of the world to her readers? Or was it, in some deeper, unspoken way, a lifelong attempt to escape her own underlying identity as Elizabeth Jane Cochran?
Wow. That is a brilliant and honestly slightly haunting question to leave on. The drive to change the world versus the drive to change oneself. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into an absolutely legendary life. Keep looking closer, keep questioning the systems around you, and never be afraid to go completely off script.